The town of Ravenport, Oregon carried a quiet charm that most people only noticed after they had already lived there for years. Pine trees lined the streets, and the Columbia River moved like a silver ribbon beside the town. It was the kind of place where memories stayed longer than people expected. 5 years earlier, inside the old brick building of Autumn Hall High School, two students had quietly believed their lives would always remain connected. Evan Callahan had been known as the thoughtful one. He rarely raised his voice and carried the calm confidence of someone who planned everything carefully. Teachers trusted him, classmates respected him, and his closest friend, Logan Pierce, often joked that Evan thought 10 steps ahead of everyone else. But Evan's life at Autumn Hall had not been defined by grades or sports. It had been defined by Clara Whitmore. Clara had arrived during their final year of high school after transferring from another state. She had an observant gaze and a quiet personality that made people curious about her. She rarely spoke about her past, but when she smiled, the tension in the room softened. Their connection had not begun dramatically. It started during a late autumn afternoon when leaves covered the school courtyard like a carpet of copper and gold. Evan had been sitting on a stone bench reviewing college forms, while Clara sat nearby sketching in a notebook. At first, they barely spoke, but the silence between them felt comfortable. Over the following weeks, they slowly grew close through shared walks across campus, study sessions in the library, and long afternoons sitting near the football field bleachers while the sun dropped behind the hills. Their relationship developed with the delicate intensity of young love. Evan admired Clara's quiet intelligence. Clara trusted Evan's steady presence. Eventually, in a moment that neither of them had fully planned, they promised something unusual for two teenagers, a promise to stay together even after graduation. That evening had taken place near the abandoned Ravenport Observatory, a hilltop structure outside town where students sometimes went to watch meteor showers. The sky had been unusually clear that night, and the stars appeared sharp enough to touch. They had walked along the railing surrounding the observatory dome while the wind carried the scent of pine trees. Clara had leaned gently against Evan, her head resting against his shoulder while the sky stretched endlessly above them. There had been warmth, closeness, and the fragile hope that young people sometimes mistake for certainty. They promised they would find their way back to each other, no matter where life carried them. For Evan, the moment felt real and permanent. For Clara, it meant something even deeper. But life after high school rarely follows promises made beneath star-filled skies. Within months, everything changed. Clara suddenly disappeared from Ravenport without explanation. Her phone stopped responding, her house stood empty. No one at Autumn Hall seemed to know why she had left. Evan had searched for answers during those first months. He asked former teachers, mutual classmates, and even Clara's old landlord, but every path ended with uncertainty. Eventually, the silence forced him to move forward. 5 years passed, and Ravenport slowly became a different place. The old observatory fell into further decay, the high school received renovations, and many of Evan's classmates moved to larger cities. Evan himself built a new life. At 23, he worked as a structural design consultant for a small architecture firm that specialized in restoring historic buildings. The job suited him well. It required patience, attention to detail, and long hours studying blueprints in quiet offices. Logan Pierce remained his closest friend, now running a successful local brewery that had quickly become popular in town. And in recent months, Evan's life had taken another turn. He had begun dating Naomi Carter. Naomi was different from Clara in nearly every way. She had an energetic personality, quick laughter, and the kind of social confidence that filled rooms effortlessly. She worked as a marketing strategist for a regional tech company and had moved to Ravenport only a year earlier. Their relationship had developed naturally. Dinners along the riverfront, weekend hikes in the surrounding forests, long drives along the coastal highway. For the first time since high school, Evan felt as though the unresolved past had finally loosened his hold on him. Yet Ravenport had a way of preserving unfinished stories. One late evening in early October, Logan hosted a small celebration at his brewery to mark the 5th anniversary of the business opening. Music filled the building while warm amber lights reflected across polished wooden tables. Friends and coworkers gathered for drinks and laughter as autumn rain tapped lightly against the windows. Evan arrived with Naomi shortly after sunset. Logan greeted them enthusiastically while guiding guests through the crowded room. The atmosphere felt relaxed and welcoming, but somewhere beneath the noise and laughter, an unexpected shift had already begun. Near the entrance of the brewery stood a woman who had just stepped inside from the rain. Her coat was dark and damp from the weather. Long hair fell across her shoulders as she paused just inside the doorway, quietly scanning the room. Her eyes stopped when they reached Evan. Time seemed to pause around her. 5 years had changed her appearance slightly. Her posture carried more confidence, and her expression showed the calm restraint of someone who had experienced more than she revealed. But there was no doubt, it was Clara Whitmore. She watched Evan for several long seconds, not with nostalgia, not with warmth, something colder, something controlled. Across the room, Evan slowly noticed her presence. At first, he only sensed someone watching him. Then his eyes met hers. The recognition hit him instantly, like an old memory breaking through the surface of water. Shock moved through him quietly. The girl who had vanished 5 years ago was now standing inside Logan's brewery. Logan himself noticed the tension as he approached with a tray of drinks. Naomi followed Evan's gaze with curiosity, trying to understand what had suddenly captured his attention so completely. But Clara did not approach immediately. She simply stood there for another moment, watching, observing the scene carefully. Evan beside Naomi, Logan nearby, the familiar environment of Ravenport surrounding them. Finally, she began walking slowly across the room. Her steps were calm and deliberate. When she reached their table, the music and conversation around them seemed strangely distant. Clara stopped directly in front of Evan. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes held an intensity that made the air between them feel heavier. For a brief moment, the past and present collided without explanation. 5 years of unanswered questions suddenly stood face to face with the life Evan had built since she disappeared. Clara looked at him carefully. Then her gaze shifted briefly towards Lernian, then towards Naomi. When her eyes returned to Evan, something unmistakable settled in her expression. A calm certainty, the calm focus of someone who had waited a very long time to say something. And when she finally spoke, the words carried a weight that immediately changed the atmosphere around the table. She told Evan that he was a cheater, not only to her, but together with the friend standing beside him and the woman sitting next to him. The accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water. No one in the room yet understood why she had returned, but Clara Whitmore had not come back to Ravenport for nostalgia. She had come back with a truth that had been waiting 5 years to surface, and Evan Callahan's past was about to become far more complicated than he ever expected. The room inside Pierce Brewery slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the brief moment of tension that followed Clara Whitmore's unexpected arrival. Music continued to flow through the speakers, glasses clinked together, and quiet laughter rose from different corners of the room. Yet, around the small wooden table where Evan sat, something had shifted permanently. Clara's words had not been loud, but they had been precise, and once spoken, they lingered in the air like a question that refused to disappear. Evan felt an unusual pressure in his chest, the kind that appears when memories that once seemed settled suddenly become uncertain again. The girl who had vanished from his life 5 years earlier was now standing only a few feet away, looking at him with the composed certainty of someone who believed she already knew the truth. What made the moment even more unsettling was that Clara's accusation had not been directed at him alone. Her gaze had moved across the table when she spoke, toward Logan, toward Naomi, toward the present life Evan had carefully built after she disappeared. Logan Pierce tried to maintain his relaxed posture, but inside he felt the same uneasy tension. His friendship with Evan stretched back more than a decade, long before the complicated events of their senior year at Autumn Hall High School. Logan had always been the more outspoken of the two, quick to joke and quick to act, while Evan tended to move through life with careful thought. But even Logan struggled to understand what Clara's sudden appearance meant. Naomi Carter, meanwhile, observed the situation with the alert curiosity of someone entering a story that had already begun long before she arrived. She knew very little about Evan's past relationship with Clara, beyond a few vague details he had mentioned months earlier. A high school romance, a sudden disappearance, no clear explanation. Naomi had never pressed him for more information because the past seemed distant and irrelevant to the life they shared now. Yet Clara's presence changed that assumption immediately. Across the table, Clara remained calm. The accusation she had delivered seemed to release something within her, as if a long-awaited moment had finally arrived. She did not appear angry in the dramatic way people often expect from confrontation. Instead, her composure made the situation even more unsettling. It was the calm certainty of someone who believed she had already uncovered something others were still trying to hide. 5 years earlier, the story between Evan and Clara ended without explanation, but for Clara Whitmore, it had never truly ended. Her mind returned briefly to those final weeks before she left Ravenport. Back then, everything had seemed simple on the surface. Graduation approaching, college decisions arriving, students preparing to scatter across the country toward different futures. Evan had appeared supportive and devoted, promising they would stay connected no matter where life carried them. But Clara had always been observant. Small details had begun to feel strange during those final weeks of school, moments that did not make sense at the time, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, unexpected absences that Evan explained casually but never in detail. Logan often appeared during those moments as well, his confident smile and relaxed humor smoothing over situations that might have seemed otherwise suspicious. At first, Clara dismissed her doubts. Young relationships often carry misunderstandings, yet the feeling persisted quietly in the background of her thoughts. Something about those final weeks had not been entirely honest. The moment that truly changed everything occurred on an unusually warm evening near the end of the school year. The event had been a senior gathering held at a lakeside property outside town. Students celebrated their final months together with music, food, and late-night conversations beneath hanging lights strung between trees. Clara remembered arriving slightly later than expected that night. She had planned to meet Evan near the water's edge, where he told her he would be waiting. But when she reached the lakeside dock, Evan was nowhere to be found. Instead, she noticed Logan speaking quietly with a small group of classmates near the boathouse. His expression seemed unusually serious, a contrast to his typical carefree attitude. Clara waited for several minutes before deciding to walk along the shoreline to search for Evan. That was when she noticed something unexpected. Evan standing further down the path, partially hidden by trees. But he was not alone. A girl stood with him. The moment had been distant enough that Clara could not hear what they were saying, yet the closeness between them immediately stirred something uncomfortable inside her chest. At first, she convinced herself she must be misunderstanding the scene. Perhaps they were simply talking. Perhaps she had arrived at an awkward moment. But when Evan finally noticed her presence, his reaction had not been relief or happiness. It had been hesitation, a brief, unmistakable pause. Later that evening, he explained the situation in a way that seemed logical enough to accept at the time. A classmate needing advice, an unexpected conversation, nothing more. Clara wanted to believe him, and she did, at least for a while. Yet something about that moment remained unsettled within her memory. Over the following days, she began noticing other small details. Evan's phone lighting up with messages he quickly silenced, Logan appearing strangely protective whenever certain topics arose, and the mysterious girl from the lakeside gathering appearing occasionally in the distance at school, watching, observing. Clara had not known her name at the time, but 5 years later she recognized that same face sitting beside Evan in Logan's brewery, Naomi Carter. The realization had arrived slowly over the past year, after Clara returned quietly to Ravenport to search for answers. She had not returned immediately after leaving town. Her life had taken her far away for several years, yet the unanswered questions from that final night at the lake continued to follow her. Eventually, curiosity became something stronger, a need to understand, and once she began investigating quietly, the connections started to appear. Logan's involvement, Evan's explanations, Naomi's sudden presence in Ravenport years later. Each piece alone meant little, but together they formed a pattern Clara could no longer ignore. Now she stood inside the brewery, watching all three of them together. Evan looked older than she remembered, his features sharper with maturity and responsibility. Logan still carried his familiar confidence, though now tempered by the seriousness of business ownership. Naomi appeared composed and observant, trying to understand the invisible history unfolding around her. For Clara, the moment felt strangely calm. 5 years of uncertainty had slowly led her back to this room, back to the people who had shaped the most confusing chapter of her life. She had not returned for revenge, at least that was what she told herself. What she wanted was clarity, truth, an explanation for the moment 5 years earlier when everything she believed suddenly felt uncertain. Evan remained silent, studying Clara with an expression that mixed surprise, confusion, and something deeper he could not yet define. Logan glanced between them, sensing that the past was beginning to reopen in ways none of them had expected. And Naomi quietly realized that the story she thought she understood about Evan's past might only be a small part of something much more complicated. Outside the brewery, rain continued to fall gently across the streets of Ravenport. Inside, 4 people stood together at the edge of a truth that had been waiting 5 years to surface. Clara Whitmore had returned with an accusation, but the deeper question remained unresolved. What exactly had happened that night near the lake before she disappeared from Ravenport, and why did Clara believe that all 3 of them had played a role in betraying her? The answers were buried somewhere within memories that none of them had yet fully confronted. But one thing was certain, the promise once made beneath the stars of the old observatory had not faded quietly with time. It had been waiting, and now the past was beginning to reveal itself piece by piece. Outside the brewery, the rain continued falling softly over Ravenport. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement, turning the quiet town into a series of blurred golden reflections. Inside, however, the air felt heavier than before. Clara Whitmore's return had reopened something that none of them had expected to confront again. For Evan Callahan, the moment felt unreal. 5 years earlier, he had spent months trying to understand why Clara vanished from Ravenport without explanation. Eventually, he accepted the silence as something he could never fully understand. Now she had returned with an accusation that suggested the past had never been as simple as he believed. Clara's eyes moved slowly between the 3 people sitting at the table: Evan, Logan, Naomi. Each of them represented a different piece of the same memory, and that memory led back to a single place: Blackwood Lake. 5 years earlier, during the final weeks before graduation, the lakeside property outside Ravenport had hosted the largest senior gathering of the year. Students from Autumn Hall High School had celebrated the approaching end of their school lives with music, bonfires, and long conversations beside the water. For most people, the night remained nothing more than a distant memory. For Clara Whitmore, it had become the moment when everything changed. Her thoughts returned there now. The lake had been calm that evening, reflecting the last orange streaks of sunset across the water. Music drifted from portable speakers, while students moved between the dock, the fire pit, and the small wooden boathouse near the edge of the property. Clara remembered arriving later than she intended. She had been delayed helping a teacher organize final exam materials earlier that afternoon, and by the time she reached the lake, the gathering had already grown lively. Her first instinct had been to search for Evan. They had planned to meet near the dock, but when she reached the water, he was not there. Instead, she saw Logan Pierce speaking quietly with several students near the boathouse. His relaxed confidence seemed slightly different that night, replaced by a more watchful energy that Clara noticed immediately. She greeted a few classmates before beginning to walk slowly along the shoreline. The trees along Blackwood Lake formed a narrow path that curved behind the property. Students sometimes used it as a quiet escape from the louder parts of the gathering. It was there that Clara noticed Evan. He stood near the edge of the trees, with someone else. The girl standing beside him looked familiar, though Clara could not immediately remember where she had seen her before. They appeared close, closer than a casual conversation would normally suggest. Clara had stopped walking without realizing it. Something about the moment felt strangely wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just slightly out of place. When Evan finally noticed her standing further down the path, his reaction had not been what she expected. For a brief second, his expression showed surprise, almost like someone caught unprepared. The girl beside him turned as well. Clara remembered noticing the sharp confidence in her posture even from a distance. Later, she would recognize that face clearly. It was Naomi Carter. But 5 years earlier, she was simply another unfamiliar student standing beside the boy Clara believed she knew better than anyone else. Evan walked toward Clara a moment later, explaining casually that the girl had asked for help with a college application essay. The explanation seemed reasonable. The lake party was full of classmates seeking last-minute advice about scholarships and universities. Clara chose to believe him, yet the moment remained quietly unsettled in her mind. What truly troubled her did not happen until later that night. After the bonfire burned lower and many students began leaving, Clara stepped away from the group to walk along the dock. She had hoped to find Evan again. Instead, she overheard something that changed everything. 2 voices carried through the darkness from the direction of the boathouse. Logan's voice was unmistakable. The other voice belonged to Naomi. Their conversation was partially hidden by distance and the sound of water against the dock, but certain fragments reached Clara clearly enough to raise questions she could not ignore. They spoke about Evan, about Clara, about a plan that seemed to involve something far more complicated than a simple high school relationship. Clara did not fully understand what she had heard at that moment, but the tone of the conversation left her unsettled. The following morning, she confronted Evan carefully, hoping he might explain what she misunderstood. Instead, his response felt strangely distant, not dishonest, but guarded. Something inside Clara shifted during that conversation. For the first time, she began to wonder whether the boy she trusted completely might be hiding something larger than she realized. The doubts grew over the next several days. Logan's behavior around her changed subtly. Naomi appeared occasionally in places she did not expect, and Evan seemed caught between explanations that never quite resolved the questions forming in Clara's mind. Eventually, the tension became too much. Clara made a decision that no one in Ravenport fully understood at the time. She left town, quietly, without telling Evan where she was going. It was easier to disappear than to remain surrounded by questions she could not answer. But the years that followed never truly erased those questions. Instead, they slowly transformed into something stronger: determination.
Clara spent years building a new life in other cities, focusing on education and work while trying to leave Ravenport behind. Yet certain memories refused to fade. The moment at the lakeside path, the conversation near the boathouse, the uneasy feeling that something important had been hidden from her. Eventually, curiosity brought her back. At first, she returned only briefly, visiting Ravenport anonymously to see how the town had changed. That's when she learned something that shocked her. Evan and Naomi now shared a relationship. Logan remained closely connected to both of them. The three names that once appeared in the strange conversation near Blackwood Lake had somehow remained tied together years later. For Clara, the realization felt like confirmation that her suspicions years earlier might not have been imagination. So she began searching more carefully. Old classmates, archived photos, social media posts, fragments of information slowly formed a pattern that made the past feel less accidental than she once believed. Now she stood inside Logan's brewery watching the three of them together. 5 years of questions had brought her back to this moment. Evan studied Clara carefully, trying to understand the meaning behind her accusation. Logan sensed the tension growing heavier with every passing second. Naomi remained quiet, though inside she felt the uncomfortable pressure of a story she did not fully understand. Clara's calm expression revealed very little emotion, but beneath that calm lay a truth she had spent years uncovering. Blackwood Lake had not been the simple misunderstanding everyone believed. Something had happened that night, something that connected Evan, Logan, and Naomi in a way Clara had only begun to understand. And now, standing in the quiet glow of the brewery lights, Clara realized that the answers she had searched for might finally begin to surface, because the past was no longer hidden, and the night at Blackwood Lake was about to be remembered in ways none of them were prepared for.
Rain continued to fall across Ravenport, the quiet town glowing beneath streetlights and reflections from wet asphalt. Inside Pierce Brewery, the music and laughter of the celebration slowly faded into the background for the small group gathered near the wooden table. For Evan Callahan, the return of Clara Whitmore felt like a door reopening to a chapter he believed had ended years earlier. Memories he had carefully placed in the past were now resurfacing with uncomfortable clarity. Logan Pierce sensed the tension in the room and tried to maintain his calm demeanor, yet even he could feel that the situation had moved beyond casual misunderstanding. Clara had not returned to Ravenport simply to revisit old memories. She had returned with purpose. Naomi Carter sat quietly beside Evan, observing every detail carefully. Until this evening, she had believed that Evan's high school relationship belonged to a distant chapter of his life, but Clara's presence suggested that the past might still hold consequences none of them had expected. Clara herself remained composed. Her posture was steady, her gaze thoughtful. The years away from Ravenport had given her a different kind of strength, one built through patience and careful reflection. For a long time, she had carried questions that no one around her seemed able to answer. Now she had come back with something more powerful than suspicion. She had come back with evidence. 5 years earlier, when she left Ravenport, she believed the confusion surrounding Blackwood Lake would eventually fade with time. But the opposite happened. The unanswered questions grew stronger, returning in quiet moments and forcing her to reconsider memories she once ignored. During her second year in Seattle, while organizing old files from her high school years, Clara discovered something she had forgotten, a small digital recorder she used for recording study notes. The device contained dozens of ordinary recordings from classes and lectures, but one file stood out, a recording dated the same night as the Blackwood Lake gathering. At first, Clara did not understand why the file existed. She did not remember using the recorder that evening. Yet curiosity led her to play the audio. What she heard changed everything. The recording began with the distant sound of water and faint music from the party. Leaves rustled in the wind and footsteps moved across gravel. It took Clara several seconds to realize what she was listening to. The recorder had been left running inside her jacket pocket when she walked near the boathouse, and the device had captured the conversation she overheard that night. Logan's voice appeared first, calm, confident. He spoke about Evan in a way Clara had never heard before, not as a friend speaking casually about another friend, but as someone involved in something carefully planned. Moments later, Naomi's voice joined the conversation. At that time, Clara had barely known who Naomi was, yet hearing her voice clearly in the recording confirmed something Clara once believed might have been a misunderstanding. The conversation revealed fragments of a plan involving Evan's future.
Logan had explained that Evan needed to focus on opportunities beyond Ravenport. A prestigious university scholarship in Boston had recently accepted him into a competitive architectural program. But the scholarship came with certain expectations. Evan needed to demonstrate academic focus and independence. Distractions from high school relationships could complicate the recommendation letters required for the program. The conversation suggested that Logan and Naomi believed Clara's relationship with Evan might interfere with his chances. Instead of discussing the situation openly, they had chosen a different approach. Naomi, who had recently transferred to Autumn Hall, agreed to become close to Evan during the final weeks of school. The intention was not necessarily to create a full relationship, only to create enough confusion that Clara might step away voluntarily. Logan had described the situation as temporary, a short-term distraction, something that would allow Evan to leave Ravenport without emotional complications. Listening to the recording years later, Clara felt the same quiet shock she experienced the night she first heard it. But there was something else in the recording that made the situation even more complicated. Evan's voice never appeared. He had not participated in the conversation. In fact, the recording suggested that Evan might not even have known about the plan Logan and Naomi discussed. For years, Clara believed Evan betrayed her intentionally, but the recording revealed something more complicated. Logan and Naomi had acted based on what they believed would help Evan's future, yet they never considered how their actions might affect Clara, or how their manipulation might fracture the trust between everyone involved. Clara never confronted them directly back then. Instead, she left Ravenport quietly, unable to face the confusion and betrayal she felt. Years passed before she finally returned to investigate what happened afterward. What she discovered surprised her again. Evan never accepted the scholarship to Boston. He remained in Oregon, choosing a local university program instead. And years later, by coincidence or by fate, Naomi Carter returned to Ravenport and eventually formed a real relationship with him. Now, the same three names connected by that hidden conversation stood together in the same room. Clara's investigation over the past year confirmed one final detail. Logan had been the one who encouraged Naomi to apply for a marketing position in Ravenport after college. Whether intentional or accidental, the connections between them had continued long after the original plan faded. Inside the brewery, Clara observed them carefully. Evan looked confused, clearly unaware of the deeper story she had uncovered. Logan's expression grew more serious as he sensed the direction Clara's explanation was leading. Naomi remained silent, but her thoughtful gaze suggested that fragments of the past were beginning to return to her memory. For Clara, the moment felt strangely calm. She had spent years searching for answers, years wondering whether her suspicions were real or imagined. Now she knew the truth was more complicated than betrayal alone. The events at Blackwood Lake had been the result of a plan designed without cruelty but executed without honesty. A plan designed without cruelty but executed without honesty. A plan that unintentionally destroyed a relationship and left unanswered questions that lasted half a decade. Clara looked at Evan again. The boy she once loved now stood before her as a man shaped by the years that followed, and for the first time she realized something unexpected. He might have been just as unaware of the truth as she once was. But the recording she carried meant that the past could no longer remain hidden. What happened at Blackwood Lake had shaped all of their lives in ways none of them fully understood, and now the truth was finally beginning to surface. Yet one final question still remained. If Evan had never known about the plan Logan and Naomi discussed that night, then why had his behavior changed so suddenly during those final days before Clara left? That answer still waited somewhere in the memories none of them had fully confronted, and the truth behind Evan's silence 5 years ago was about to become the final piece of a story that had been waiting far too long to be finished.
The rain over Ravenport finally began to fade, leaving behind a quiet mist that drifted through the streets like a soft curtain. Inside Pierce Brewery, the celebration that had once filled the building with laughter was now slowly winding down. Most guests had already left. Only a few scattered conversations remained near the bar. But at the wooden table near the center of the room, 4 people were still standing inside the shadow of a past that had taken 5 years to return. Clara Whitmore had revealed the existence of the recording she discovered. Logan Pierce stood silently, his confident personality now replaced by the uneasy realization that something he once considered harmless had shaped the lives of everyone around him. Naomi Carter sat quietly beside Evan, trying to process the memory Clara described. The events of that night at Blackwood Lake had once felt distant and unimportant, but now the weight of those decisions felt impossible to ignore. Evan Callahan remained still for a long moment. His eyes moved slowly between Clara, Logan, and Naomi. The story Clara uncovered had revealed something he never knew existed, a plan made in his name, a plan that destroyed the relationship he once believed was the most meaningful connection in his life. But the most painful realization was something else. Clara had believed he was part of it. For 5 years, she had carried that belief. Evan felt the quiet ache of a truth that now demanded to be spoken. 5 years earlier, during the last weeks before graduation, Evan had indeed been offered the scholarship Logan mentioned. The opportunity had been extraordinary, a prestigious architecture program in Boston that could have opened doors across the country. Teachers encouraged him to accept it immediately. Logan had been especially excited about the opportunity, convinced that leaving Ravenport was the best decision Evan could make. But the scholarship required one thing Evan struggled to accept. It meant leaving Clara behind. During those final weeks, Evan spent long nights thinking about the decision. The future the scholarship promised was powerful and exciting, but the thought of walking away from the relationship he had built with Clara made the choice far more complicated than anyone else seemed to understand. That was why he had gone to the lakeside gathering that night. He planned to tell Clara everything. He planned to ask if she would consider building a future together, even if it meant distance and uncertainty. But the night unfolded differently. When Evan spoke briefly with Naomi near the trees, the conversation had been simple. Naomi had asked him questions about the scholarship and his future plans, something many students were curious about during those final weeks of school. Evan never knew Logan and Naomi had discussed anything more complicated behind his back. Later that evening, after Clara saw them together near the path, Evan sensed that something felt wrong. Clara seemed distant, uncertain, but before he could explain everything, she left the party earlier than expected. The following day, he tried to speak with her again, yet every conversation between them felt slightly strained. Clara appeared guarded, as if she had already reached conclusions she did not want to explain. Evan believed she was slowly losing interest in the relationship as graduation approached. Many students were separating emotionally as they prepared for new lives in different cities. Eventually, he stopped pushing for explanations. He told himself that perhaps their relationship simply reached its natural ending. But the truth was that he never stopped wondering why Clara disappeared so suddenly. The silence she left behind followed him for years. That silence influenced the decision he made shortly afterward. Evan declined the Boston scholarship. Instead, he chose a university program closer to home. Logan never fully understood that choice, but Evan knew exactly why he made it, because leaving Ravenport after Clara vanished felt like abandoning a question that had never been answered. Years passed before Naomi returned to town through work opportunities, and their relationship slowly developed long after the events of high school faded into distant memories. But now the truth had finally returned. The misunderstanding that separated them had not been caused by Evan's betrayal. It had been created by a plan Logan and Naomi believed would help Evan succeed. A plan built with good intentions, but hidden behind silence and manipulation. Clara listened carefully as the pieces finally came together. For the first time, she saw the full picture that had remained incomplete for 5 years. The recording she discovered revealed the plan Logan and Naomi discussed, but Evan's explanation revealed the final truth she never knew. He had not betrayed her. He had never even known the plan existed. The realization settled slowly inside Clara's mind. For years, she believed the boy she trusted had chosen ambition and manipulation over honesty. Now she understood that both of them had been separated by the same misunderstanding, a quiet manipulation that none of them fully intended to create. Logan looked down at the floor for a long moment. The confident friend who once believed he was helping Evan now understood that his decision had caused far more harm than he ever imagined. Naomi remained silent, recognizing that her participation in Logan's plan had contributed to the confusion that followed. The quiet weight of those years hung between them. Finally, Clara looked at Evan again. The anger she carried for so long had already begun to soften during the past year as she uncovered more pieces of the story. But standing here now, hearing the truth directly from him, allowed something else to appear: understanding. Not the innocent hope of the teenagers who once stood together beneath the stars of Ravenport Observatory, but the mature clarity that sometimes arrives only after time has reshaped everything. Outside the brewery, the rain had completely stopped. The clouds above Ravenport slowly parted, revealing a clear night sky. Evan glanced toward the window where the stars had begun to appear faintly above the town. It reminded him of a place he had not visited in years, the old observatory on the hill, the place where two teenagers once promised to find their way back to each other no matter where life carried them. That promise had not survived the confusion of youth, but the truth behind its ending had finally been revealed. Clara stood quietly for a moment before turning toward the door. She had not returned to Ravenport seeking revenge. What she wanted most was understanding. Now she had finally found it. The past no longer felt like an unfinished mystery. It felt like a story that had simply taken 5 years to reach its ending. As Clara stepped outside into the cool night air, the streets of Ravenport looked peaceful beneath the clearing sky. Behind her, inside the brewery, Evan remained standing beside Naomi and Logan, each of them silently reflecting on the strange path that had brought them all back together. The promise once made beneath the observatory stars had never truly been fulfilled, but the truth that finally surfaced that night gave the past something it never had before: closure. And sometimes, after years of silence, closure was the most powerful ending a story could receive.